then they would make demands.
Well, but I think part of the reason why is because they had no faith in the existing political institutions and their ability to deliver upon those demands. And in a way, the encompassing, I think, meta demand was to be able to, once again, run their own lives. They wanted to be able to participate in the...
Isn't that quintessentially liberal? I mean, isn't it quintessentially like... I mean, the old beer and politics of what we want is, in a sense, the freedom to live in our own little communal way outside of the state. We've given up on sort of the state. And and you read Graeber and you read Simon Critchley and you read all these folks. It's the distance from the state. Graeber's like the point of direct action is to find spaces of freedom, right? Interestingly enough, Arendt uses the word spaces of freedom a lot in On Revolution and in other essays. But for her, spaces of freedom are councils. They're places where people come together in public to act. Whereas for Graeber and for Critchley, spaces of freedom are places where we keep people apart and exist in a small group, distinguished from the state and outside of politics. And to me, it's this difference, right, which is the difference that matters in current thinking about politics today versus Arendt. Today, people want to think about politics as a space of freedom divorced from politics, divorced from the state. Whereas for Arendt, a space of freedom had to, in a sense, be engaged with, in a revolutionary sense, rethinking the state.
My response to what you're saying lies in the ambiguity of the word politics, the way you just used it a couple of times. So it's kind of the question of whether you think that a movement or an entity that doesn't want anything to do with existing political institutions or electoral systems or whatever is apolitical. And I'm suggesting that it's not, right? In fact, I'm suggesting that it's political precisely because it doesn't want to have anything to do with those institutions, because those institutions have demonstrated themselves to be very apolitical, right? They merely run after and in the service of economic imperatives. They're kind of like hollow and empty expressions of one's participation in a polity, right? Like, I think that these movements were political precisely because they rejected that. And look, they are protest movements. There was something that they were.
But there's a difference between liberation and revolution, right?
There is, but there's also a difference between.
Revolution has to build something.
That's true, but there's also a difference. There was a building, I think, in Occupy, and it's the difference between. I mean, I'm old enough to have been a participant in the protests that happened, the anti-globalization protests, as they were called, that happened in the 90s in relation to the World Bank, the IMF, and the WTO. And that was a protest movement, so it organized marches and rallies and puppet shows, whatever. And the difference is that in the case of Occupy, you didn't, in the 90s, you didn't have people sitting around saying, okay, now let's have a General Assembly, and here's what the meeting procedure is going to be, and here's what's on the agenda, and here's how we choose who gets to speak next, and here, that kind of, as I have been putting it, taking itself as a political subject, is something that I think is quite remarkable.
I view the Occupy, the fundamental issue of Occupy as voice. Not so much as what the voice says, but just creating a mechanism for voices to be heard.
Yeah, it was just, people were starved for political participation and political discussion. And that's what they endeavored to create in a park or, in meetings that were held, because of course not all of the activity was happening in Zuccotti Park. That Occupy spurred, for example, I was telling you, city-wide meetings of students from CUNY, Columbia, the New School, Juilliard, wherever, talking about the issues that they're facing in common, including rising student debt, increasing tuition rates, the commodification of education in general, dwindling of resources. I mean, that's not something that's remarkable, and that's not something that existed prior to that. it may have at moments 20 years ago, 30 years, but nobody around today knows that. But so I think that it was politically invigorating in all kinds of interesting ways, where all of a sudden people had this desire to sit down and have meetings about stuff and talk about how we can mobilize ourselves in relation to these issues.
Mm-hmm. Well, all that is great, and I agree with most of what you just said. What's shocking to me is that people can write like Simon Critchley does, that we're experiencing a moment of utter delegitimization of democratic politics, right? And I largely think he's right to a certain degree. And yet, you see Occupy happen. You see a financial crisis happen. And there's a moment in which the population, not the under 1% of the population that participated in Occupy events, but the population, could choose, do we want to try and change the system? And while they were supportive of Occupy in the protest role, they clearly didn't support it, as far as I read the situation, in the sense of we want to trade in what we have for something else.
Or they didn't know what they were being offered.
Yeah,
Well, part of it is they didn't know, but that's part of my point, is that there was no offering. There was no willingness of Occupy, the people, to actually try and offer something.
That was a deliberate choice.
Well, actually,
Well, and I agree, and it's a deliberate choice, because the new theory is that freedom is found in protest, not in building something.
That's not true. So, for example, there were working groups in Occupy that were literally made up of current or former Wall Streeters, lawyers, bankers. Carney Ross was part of one of them. I forget what it was like. It was called the banking working group or something. And they were literally drawing up. They were literally drawing up alternative legislative policy to address the kind of crisis that had just happened. Alternative banking.
Legislative policies doesn't challenge the legitimacy of the system.
No, it doesn't. But I'm saying that there were it was a heterogeneous movement that included a lot of different kinds of activities. But I mean, if you're asking whether it had any positive program whatsoever, my response is yes, it had stuff like that.
That's not what I'm asking.
If you're asking whether it offered a wholesale alternative and replacement of all existing institutions with alternatives, well then of course not.
No, I'm asking whether we should think of it as revolutionary within Arendt's thinking, or as a protest movement. And I think those are very different. And I think Arendt offers us serious resources to think about the difference between those two. And I think it's important to think about it, because a protest movement in the end, is important. No one was the protest that they were engaged in, I think 99% of people agreed with. What they didn't agree with was the revolutionary call. And
what would you say the revolutionary call was?
well, that's part of the problem. It never was made. But I understand the revolutionary call, and I taught a course on it last year. I tried to engage in it. If you read Simon and you read David Graeber and you read, people in the movement, people read Rancière, whatever, it was that freedom is found in protest, in distance from state, in sort of moments of standing outside.
But that's
and I think that's become too much of a the left has become infatuated with this sort of dropping out
I
aspect.
think that parts of it have, and then by your own terms, that's not a revolutionary call, that's a sort of protest call. But I think that you're right that there is that problematic strain in contemporary leftist writing, and you see it, for example, in Simon Critchley's writing, where, in a sense, and in Rancière's writing, if the only real legitimate form of political activity is resistance or protest, then you're kind of making the state transcendental.
Yeah.
And I think that that's highly problematic. Now, to what extent there was that kind of thinking going on in Occupy, I think it was there. I don't think it was necessarily dominant. But I agree with you about the problematicness of that kind of thinking. And I like her because she's more positive than that. Right.
But this is the point I have is, when you asked for positive, everyone said, oh, well, we don't want to make demands, or we have legislative committees. But there was no thinking that was positive in the sense of our end, of creating new institutions of politics, of actually trying to, except for the example, except for, look, we're having self-government. And, you know, the question was, do you even take that seriously as a way of governing the United States of America today?
There's, I mean, it's somewhat unfair. Again, I don't know what you're asking. I don't know if you're asking whether they should have, like, drawn up plans for an alternate society. That's not something that I think is a realistic request, and it's also not something that Arendt describes either. When she's talking about the council system, she's saying that people kind of, through their own collective action, spontaneously figured out new ways of doing things. She says they didn't do it on the basis of a program.
Yeah.
So, and I think it would have been bizarre.
But they wanted to govern their factories, right? They wanted to govern their town councils.
Right.
That's what I thought that's what I love about Occupy.
Yeah.
The people in Occupy wanted to do what? Govern Zuccotti Park.
And I
think
you're
that
right
was the mistake.
That I agree with, and that was something that I wrote about and talked about in meetings, like, from the get-go. And in fact, I wrote an editorial on, like, the 24th of September, so like a week after it started, saying, like, look, for this to be of real significance, it has to move into exactly the spaces in which we already exist and operate. And that's why I personally was involved more in things like student organizing, because I'm a student, workplace organizing because I'm a worker, tenant organizing in my building as a tenant, rather than sitting through the GAs in Zuccotti Park, which I actually admittedly found, like, stultifyingly boring and frustrating. So I agree with you on that point. It has to actually move into the institutions in which we already circulate.
We have to end because we're all have to go to class. Thank you very much, Marianne. I appreciate it.